going on? All thanks for tuning in once again. Let's talk Itauma versus Whyte. It's fight week. This fight here is very interesting. Moses Itauma is very rated. He's very rated. A lot of people are saying that he's going to be the next heavyweight champ. We've heard about these sparring stories. Dillian Whyte, he's coming in shape for this fight. This isn't an overweight Whyte. This isn't a Whyte that's not showing up to the press conference. Dillian Whyte seems confident that he can beat Itauma. He had a lot of fighters that he could have chosen to fight. The scary thing is that, Chisora turns down the Itauma fight. Itauma spars with Joshua Fury. He's sparred with all these guys. Dubois, Joe Joyce. So it seems like he's the real deal. Time will tell. We've heard a lot of stories about Martin Bakole, about how he's the sparring undisputed champion, how he cuffed around Alexander Usyk and he beat guys up and dropped guys. But sparring's a lot different than at the actual fight. The ounces of gloves are different. Didn't we see Bakole get hurt from Michael Hunter? Didn't we see Bakole get knocked out from Parker? Yes, I know it was short notice, but all I'm saying is that sparring is different to fighting. The ounces of gloves and things like that. There is no messing around when it comes to the actual fight. So that's what it's going to come down to for me. Can he take a punch? Because it seems like he has the footwork, the timing. I've seen a couple of Itauma's fights. Again, I haven't really seen him fight top opposition, but I have seen him box on the front foot and the back foot. He's also a southpaw. It seems like he's got everything in his favour. He's got youth on his side. He's got an amateur background. He's definitely confident as well. He rates himself as a higher IQ than Usyk. So we're gonna find out. We're gonna find out how good he really is. Like I said, Chisora turned him down. Chisora, we know he's looking for his last fight, and he was offered the fight and he turned it down. He said that, hey, listen, I'm not gonna fight this guy. Basically because he believes that he's a big threat. He wants Dillian Whyte to fight him, and Whyte took the challenge, and Chisora's, questioning why did he take the challenge. That's how highly rated Moses Itauma is. Obviously Dillian Whyte offered Chisora a fight. He wasn't interested in that. Obviously the money wasn't there, So there's a big hype around Itauma. This is pay-per-view. This is a main event, I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong. A main event on a rehab card. We got guys like Herkovic on the undercard. It's a big card. Herkovic, we know he's been fighting guys like Dubois. Dubois just finished fighting Usyk. So Itauma's getting a main event. This is how highly rated he is from Turkey Al-Sheikh. Let's face it, Turkey's the one that's really putting these cards together. He's putting up the money. He wants to see Itauma versus Usyk. That's how rated he is. So Dillian Whyte, he's going to fight Itauma. Like I said, it looks like he's prepared. It looks like he is coming in shape. He's showing up to these conferences, face-offs. He's looking in great shape. He's training hard. I've seen him training for the fight. He believes that he can beat Itauma. Dillian Whyte is a guy that he likes to come forward. Doesn't really have much head movement, which is his weakness. He can't really box on the back foot well. He likes to come forward, aggressive with the jab. And, the uppercuts is kryptonite, isn't it? So, for Itauma, with the timing, it's going to be very hard for Dillian Whyte to win this fight. You know, it's going to be very hard for him to trouble Itauma, especially if it goes late, because Dillian Whyte's known for gassing out. You know, we saw that in the Parker fight. Winning the fight, you know, knocked down Parker, and then last round comes, you know, gets dropped. Looks like he's out of energy, doesn't he? You know, looks like he's got nothing left in the tank. So I know that he is looking chum, but, you know, he does really throw his punches using his weight. You know, he does overthrow punches, you know, puts a lot of power into punches. And, you know, it's going to be a big problem for him if Itauma is able to box on the back foot and avoid, you know, getting clipped early. You know, it's going to be a very hard fight for him to beat Itauma in the later rounds. So Dillian Whyte's only chance is really to, you know, be accurate with the jab. Don't allow Itauma to fight his fight. You know, he's got to turn it into a brawl. He's got to turn it into a fight. You know, you can't box Itauma. You know, Itauma's very gifted. Like I said, he can box on the back foot. Good timing, good power in both hands. You know, he also got a knockout, I believe, in his last fight with his right hand. You know, Itauma's southpaw. He can throw that punch in any angle. You know, he's not just looking for a straight. This isn't Deontay Wilder, you know, just looking for one shot. You know, he can throw that punch however he wants. And so, I mean, let's see if he's the real deal. You know, let's see if he's the real deal. I know that Dillian Whyte didn't look too good against, I mean, in his last fight. You know, I know that he wasn't mentally there or whatever, physically there as well. You know, the chance that he did get a title shot against Tyson Fury, you know, looked like he didn't belong in the ring with Fury. But again, you know, I believe that Dillian Whyte had problems outside of the ring. You know, this Dillian Whyte's showing up, you know, looks very confident, looks in shape. And, you know, like I said, Dillian Whyte chose Itauma. You know, he had multiple fights that he could have taken. You know, he could have waited for Joshua. He could have waited for possibly a Chisora fight. You know, he could have fought other guys. You know, Joseph Parker. You know, he could have fought other guys, and he chose Itauma. You know, Itauma, 20 years old, I believe. So Dillian Whyte's gonna, you know, we know him as, you know, being a rough fighter. Likes to, you know, scrap and, you know, fight and, like I said, come forward, you know, throw guys around, put forearm in the face and things like that. You know, he likes rough fights. So let's see if he can roughen up Itauma. Can Itauma avoid Dillian Whyte, especially in the first 6 rounds? You know, that's very crucial here. Because, you know, the thing is that, you know, we know guys like Tank Davis and, you know, people, you know, they like to try to figure guys out. Terence Crawford, another guy, you know, figure guys out and then, you know, take them out. You know, take a couple of rounds to figure things out. So those rounds that he's figuring things out, Itauma, Dillian Whyte needs to really roughen him up and land something big. You know, test out the chin. The only hope here is for him to knock him out. You know, can he knock him out? How good is Itauma's chin without sparring? You know, like I mentioned in the start, you know, the ounces of gloves are different, you know, in the actual fight. So let's see how good Itauma is. If Itauma blows out Dillian Whyte and knocks him out, you know, lays him out on the ground, you know, irons him out, knockout within 3-4 rounds, I believe that he will get a title shot. And I believe that it may be against Alexander Usyk. You know, I think that Usyk will push for that. You know, just depends how good Itauma looks. So, is he the real deal? You know, leave your take in the comments. Feel free to leave your opinion, you know. But yeah, if you do leave a comment or you don't, appreciate your time tuning in, and I'll catch you next time. Peace.